She stood on a wooden platform in the center of town while men placed bids on her like she was a horse at auction. 24 years old, daughter of a dead man, sold to settle debts she never made. Tessa Holloway gripped the rope they'd tied around her wrists and told herself she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these men who had eaten at her father's table and now stood with their wallets out, deciding what she was worth. Then a shadow fell across the square. A horse. A rider. And every man in Black Ridge went very, very quiet. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and follow along to the end. I want to see just how far this story travels. The trouble with Black Ridge was that it had always been the kind of town that turned its back on you the moment you stopped being useful. Tessa had grown up understanding this in the way children understand most hard truths, not through any single lesson, but through years of small observations stacked quietly on top of one another. She'd watched it happen to the Garner family when their well dried up 2 summers in a row. She'd watched it happen to old Vic Pruitt after his hand stopped working well enough to hold a hammer. And now, standing in the dust outside her father's house on the morning after they buried him, she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that it was happening to her. Raymond Holloway had died on a Tuesday. By Thursday, men were already coming to the door. Not to offer condolences, or not only that, they came with papers, ledgers, figures that didn't make sense to Tessa because she'd never seen them before, had no idea her father kept accounts in multiple places, had no idea the debts had grown so large and so varied that the total number, when Silas Greer from the bank laid it out on the kitchen table, made her sit down hard in her mother's old chair and just stare at the wall for a moment. $412, Greer said. He was a narrow man with a thin mustache and the careful, pleasant expression of someone who had learned that bad news goes down easier when delivered with a smile. That's the figure we're working with, Miss Holloway. The land itself might cover some of it, depending on what we can get for the northern parcel, but there are other creditors besides the bank. What other creditors? Well, he shuffled his papers. There's the feed merchant. There's Del Horn for the lumber last spring. There's Wallace Cade, who apparently extended your father a personal loan some years back. Wallace Cade. The name sat wrong in her mouth. My father borrowed money from Wallace Cade? That's what the paper says. My father hated Wallace Cade. Greer's smile didn't waver. People do business with all sorts of folks they're not fond of, Miss Holloway. That's the nature of necessity. She looked at the paper he slid toward her. It had her father's signature on it. She'd seen that signature 1,000 times. On birthday letters, on grocery lists pinned to the door, on the deed to the house that now hung slightly crooked above the fireplace. She stared at it for a long time. When was this signed? March of last year. My father was sick last March. He had a fever that kept him in bed for 6 weeks. Greer's expression softened by precisely the amount required to suggest sympathy without actually committing to it. I understand this is a difficult time, but the signature is there, and the debt is there, and I'm afraid the situation does need to be resolved. She asked them to leave. They left, but they came back, and they brought others with them. And within a week of her father's burial, the house felt less like her home, and more like a place where men came to count things and write numbers in small books and confer in low voices just outside her earshot. The worst part wasn't the debt. The worst part was the way they looked at her. She'd always been aware that she was a woman alone in a place that didn't have much use for women who were alone. Her mother had died when Tessa was 11, and she'd spent the years since then learning how to do most things herself. How to fix the fence when the posts rotted, how to drive the wagon to market and negotiate a fair price for the eggs and the winter squash. How to smile at the men in town in a way that was friendly but communicated nothing, because communicating something usually led to complications. She'd gotten good at being invisible in the way that women in her position had to be. Present enough to get by, unremarkable enough to be left alone. That was over now. Now they looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving. It was Dolores Finch who told her bluntly over the fence between their properties on a Wednesday morning. They're talking about a settlement arrangement, Dolores said. She was a stout woman in her 60s who had outlived 2 husbands and currently kept 17 chickens and no patience for softening bad news. I heard Greer and Cade talking about it at the dry goods store. They're saying it's the only practical solution. What kind of settlement arrangement? Dolores looked at her over the fence with an expression that contained equal parts pity and the grim satisfaction of someone who had always known the world was exactly this bad. The marrying kind. Tessa stared at her. I'm sorry? They want to put you up for settlement. Find a husband who'll take on the debt in exchange for, well, for you. She paused. There's men who'd do it. Widowers, mostly. Men who need a woman to cook and keep house and don't want the trouble of a courtship. That's not a settlement arrangement, Tessa said. That's an auction. Dolores nodded. I know it is. And people are they're just agreeing to this? Most of them. Dolores's voice dropped. Tessa, the ones with the power in this town, they've already decided. I'm telling you so you've got a few days to figure out if there's somewhere you can go. Family somewhere? Anyone? There wasn't. There had only ever been her father and the house and Black Ridge. She had cousins somewhere in the east who she'd never met and wouldn't know how to find. She had $12 in a tin box under her bed and a horse that was getting old. Thank you, Dolores, she said, and went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. Her father's coat still hung on the peg by the door. She'd meant to move it and hadn't been able to bring herself to do it yet. $412. She thought about the number. She thought about the signature on Cade's paper and how wrong it had looked. Right and wrong at the same time. Like something close to true, but not quite. She thought about her father in bed last March with a fever that had turned his face gray and made his hands shake, and she tried to imagine him signing his name to anything in that condition. She couldn't, but she also didn't know what to do with that because she had no proof of anything, and Silas Greer had the paper, and Wallace Cade had whatever influence he needed, and she was a 24-year-old woman with $12 and no one in her corner. She went to the kitchen and made herself some coffee and told herself she would think of something. She didn't think of something. The morning of the auction, she refused to call it anything else, even in her own head, arrived on a clear Saturday with an unpleasant cheerfulness, the sky bright blue and cloudless, the air carrying the first warmth of the approaching summer. She put on her best dress, which was blue cotton, because she'd decided the night before that if she was going to be humiliated, she was at least going to be humiliated in the dress that made her look most like herself. And then she walked out of her house and down the main street of Black Ridge with her chin up and her hands loose at her sides. The square was already full of people. That was the thing that hit her hardest. Not the platform someone had knocked together from rough lumber, not the crowd of men standing around it with their hats pushed back and their thumbs in their belts, but the women. The women of Black Ridge standing in a cluster near the post office, watching. A few of them looked away when Tessa came into view. A few more met her eyes with something that might have been apology. Most of them just watched. The way you watch something uncomfortable from a safe distance, relieved it isn't happening to you. Mabel Greer, Silas's wife, was the only one who walked up to her. Tessa. She took her arm gently. There's still time to... If you'd only agree to speak with Howard Palmer, he's been very... I know what Howard Palmer wants, Tessa said. He wants someone to cook his meals and sleep in his bed and not cause him trouble. He said as much when he came to the house. Well, some women, not me. She said it quiet, not angry. Let go of my arm, please, Mabel. Mabel let go. Her face crumpled briefly into something genuine, guilt maybe, or the shape of it, and then settled back into the careful blankness that everyone seemed to be wearing today. Silas Greer stepped up onto the platform and cleared his throat. All right, he said, we're here to settle the estate of the late Raymond Holloway and address the outstanding debts therein, as has been arranged. Tessa stopped listening to the words. She stood below the platform where they'd directed her and looked out at the crowd and felt something go very still inside her. Not calm, not resignation. Something harder than both of those things. Something that didn't have a name she knew. That felt like what happened to iron when you put it in a fire long enough. Not destroyed, but changed into something that wouldn't bend as easily as it had before. She counted the men in the crowd. 30, maybe 35. She recognized most of their faces. She'd sold eggs to those men. She'd passed the time of day with them on the street. She'd watched their children run past her fence and sometimes stop to wave. They were watching her the way you watch something being sold. Who'll start the bidding? Greer said. Someone called out a number, then another. She heard her own name a few times, attached to various assessments of her domestic capabilities. Her cooking, her evident good health, the fact that she knew how to handle livestock. She stood very still and looked at a point somewhere above the heads of the crowd and thought about the horse that would need to be watered this afternoon if she was still around to do it, and about her father's coat on the peg by the door, and about the signature on the paper that didn't look quite right. And then the crowd went quiet. Not gradually, suddenly. The kind of quiet that a crowd makes when something appears that it didn't expect. She looked toward the edge of the square. A rider had come into town. He came at a walk, which made it worse somehow. The unhurried quality of it, the horse's hooves raising small puffs of dust in the dry street. The rider was a tall man. She could see that even in the saddle, and he wore a dark coat and no hat, and he had the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to keep his body very quiet in a world that often gave him reasons to move fast. She didn't know who he was, but the people around her did, because she could feel the recognition move through the crowd like a cold wind, the way everybody's posture changed and their voices dropped, and the space between them and the approaching rider seemed to expand all at once, everybody edging backward without quite meaning to. She heard his name whispered in several places at once. Colt Mercer. She'd heard the name. Everyone in the territory had heard the name. Colt Mercer was the kind of man that people talked about in the way they talked about floods and droughts, as a force that existed outside the normal order of things, that could arrive without warning and leave destruction behind it. The stories were wild and contradictory, the way stories about feared men always were. He'd killed 6 men in Dorado County, or 11 or 16, depending on who was telling it. He'd robbed the freight company's strongbox twice. He'd burned a rancher's barn outside of Creek Fall, and the fire spread to 3 adjacent properties. He had a bounty on his head that had been growing steadily for 3 years, and that now stood at something like $300, or $400, or more. She'd imagined, without ever really thinking about it, that a man with that kind of reputation would look a certain way. Wild-eyed, maybe, scarred, the kind of face that advertised what was behind it. The man who rode into Black Ridge's square looked like none of that. He was somewhere north of 30, with dark hair starting to grow long around his collar, and a face that was weathered and angular without being harsh. The kind of face that would be handsome in different circumstances, that might have been described as handsome even now if you were willing to look past the fact that half the men in the square were currently putting hands to their holsters. He looked around the square with the mild interest of someone taking stock of an unfamiliar place, and his gaze swept across the platform and the crowd, and Silas Greer, and landed, briefly, on Tessa. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. Then he looked at Greer. "This an auction?" he said. His voice was unhurried, pitched to carry without effort. "It's a settlement arrangement," Greer said stiffly. "Private community business. Nothing that concerns strangers." "What's the current bid?" A silence. Then someone said, from somewhere in the back, 85. 110, Colt Mercer said. The crowd made a sound that wasn't quite any single thing. Part outrage, part shock, part the particular helplessness of men who want to object but can't quite find the grounds. Howard Palmer, who had apparently been the $85 offer, took a step forward. "You've got no business here, Mercer. This is 120, Mercer said, looking at Palmer the way you look at something mildly inconvenient. 150, Palmer snapped. 200. The number landed like something heavy dropped from height. $200. Tessa watched Palmer's face go through several colors and emotions before landing on the pale, furious expression of a man who's been outmatched and knows it and hates knowing it. You can't just... He looked at Greer. "Silas, you can't let a wanted man." "The bid stands," Greer said. And Tessa thought she heard something in his voice that was almost relief, though she couldn't imagine why. No one else bid. "That's in." They gave her 10 minutes to get what she could from the house. She didn't let herself rush, even though every instinct was pulling at her to hurry, to grab things without thinking, to get it over with before she changed her mind about keeping her composure. She folded 2 dresses into her bag. Her mother's silver comb, missing 2 teeth, the tin with the $12 in it, a winter coat, her father's old jackknife that she'd carried in her pocket since she was 16. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at her father's coat on the peg. She took it down, rolled it up and pushed it into the bag. Then she walked out of the house without looking back. Because looking back was a trap she couldn't afford. Mercer was waiting at the edge of the square with 2 horses, his own and one she didn't recognize. A brown mare with a calm face that he must have had brought around somehow. He held the reins out to her without speaking. She took them, looked at him. "Where are we going?" "Away from here," he said. "That's enough for now." She could have argued. She thought about arguing. She thought about the $12 and the tin and the horse she'd had to leave behind and the house she was likely never going to see again, and she thought about her father's signature on the paper that didn't look right, and she got on the horse. They rode out of Black Ridge without another word, and the town watched them go. The first hour was silence. Not comfortable silence, the other kind where 2 people are sharing a very small amount of space and both of them are aware of everything that isn't being said. She rode slightly behind him and watched the back of his shoulders and tried to figure out what she was dealing with, what category of danger she'd moved from into, because she wasn't naive enough to think this was rescue. Men like Colt Mercer didn't ride into towns and spend $200 on strangers out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a reason she'd been purchased, and she didn't know what it was yet, and the not knowing was a specific kind of fear, not the screaming kind, but the quiet kind that settles into your chest and waits. "You can stop trying to figure out if I'm going to hurt you," he said, without turning around. "I'm not. People say a lot of things." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair." She rode up alongside him. Looking at him directly was easier than she'd expected. He didn't have the quality she'd been bracing for, whatever quality she'd attributed to the name Colt Mercer in her head. He just looked tired, mostly, and watchful, in the particular way of someone who'd spent a long time in situations where not being watchful could get you killed. "Why?" she said. He glanced at her. "Why what?" "Why'd you do it?" "Buy me, or whatever it is we're calling it. You didn't know me. You could have kept riding." He looked at the trail ahead of them for a moment. "I know what it looks like when a town decides to make someone disappear," he said. "Seen it a few times." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let it sit. He didn't add anything, and she was starting to get a sense that this was how he talked, in pieces, with gaps between them that he didn't feel obligated to fill. She wasn't sure yet whether that was because he was withholding or because he was simply a man who didn't see the point of words that didn't carry something. They made camp that evening in a hollow between 2 ridges where the trees were thick enough to block most of the wind. He set up the fire with the efficient movements of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and she set up her bedroll on the opposite side of it, and they sat across from each other eating hardtack and dried venison while the night came down. "Colt Mercer," she said finally. He looked at her. "That's what they called you, back in town, when you rode in. That's my name. I know what they say about you." "Most of it's wrong," he said. Flat. Not defensive, not pleading, just a statement of fact, offered the way you'd offer information about the weather. She looked at him across the fire. "The freight company strongbox. Were you there?" He picked at a piece of hardtack. "I was there. I didn't take it." "Who did?" A pause. He looked at the fire. "Men who work for a man named Harlan Cade." She went very still. "Wallace Cade's son," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You know that name?" "Wallace Cade claims my father borrowed money from him." She watched his face. $400. Last March, when my father was sick in bed. There's a paper with my father's signature on it." Mercer was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked between them. An owl called somewhere in the trees above them and fell silent. "Your father," he said slowly. "Raymond Holloway." "You knew him?" "Knew of him. He had land on the north end of Black Ridge, right up against the creek." He paused. "Land that sits on top of the best water source in the county. Land that certain people have been trying to get their hands on for 2 years." The ground shifted under her, or felt like it did. She thought about the debt that hadn't made sense. The signature she couldn't account for. The way Greer had said the debt is there with such careful certainty, as if certainty alone could make something true. "They killed my father," she said. It wasn't a question. It came out of her mouth already formed, already understood, The way some truths arrive, not discovered, but recognized. Mercer didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. I don't know that they killed him. I know your father was trying to document something. Land records that didn't match, sales that never happened, deeds signed over by people who swore they'd never signed them. He'd been gathering papers for months. He met her eyes. I know he was found dead 2 weeks after he made contact with the circuit judge's office. She sat with that. And they framed you, she said. Started 3 years ago. I had land too. Smaller, but it sat on the pass they need to control the supply route north. When I wouldn't sell, the trouble started. The warrant. The stories. He said it without self-pity, which was the only way she might have believed him. A man who was lying would have been more emotional about it. Harlan Cade has the sheriff and both deputies in his pocket. His father runs the bank and half the commerce in Black Ridge. Between the two of them, they can make a man into whatever they need him to be. And my father's land? If you were sold to a man like Palmer, someone who'd deed the land over in exchange for certain favors, the Cades would have what they've been working toward for 2 years. He looked at her steadily. With you out of the picture. I was the last obstacle, she said quietly. The auction wasn't about settling your father's debts. It was about getting you somewhere you couldn't cause trouble. He paused. I'm guessing your father told you things, showed you things. He was right, though she hadn't understood it at the time. Her father had been careful, meticulous, the kind of man who kept his own records because he'd learned early not to trust other people's. He'd sat at the kitchen table on winter evenings with his ledgers and his papers, and sometimes he'd said things. Not to her directly, just thinking out loud while she sewed or read nearby. Land doesn't transfer without a deed. A man who controls water controls everything downstream. Somebody's been moving survey lines, Tessa, and I intend to find out whose hand was on the chain. She thought he was just talking about ranching, about the ordinary disputes that came up between neighbors over fence lines and water rights. She hadn't understood that he was building a case. Where did he put them? She asked. Whatever he found. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 3 months. She looked at him across the fire. He looked back, and she thought, with the part of her that had always been better at reading situations than she was given credit for, that this was the actual reason he'd ridden into Black Ridge. Not to rescue her, not out of the goodness of his heart. He'd needed to get to her before the Cades made sure she disappeared somewhere she couldn't talk. You need me, she said. He didn't deny it. Yes. And whatever my father hid, the papers, the records, they'd clear your name. They'd do more than that. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. There are families who lost their land. People run off or bought out for nothing by men working for the Cades. If your father's documentation is what I think it is, it would unwind everything they've built in that county for the last decade. She thought about the women standing near the post office, watching. She thought about Dolores over the fence, telling her with the flat compassion of someone who'd already accepted the inevitable. She thought about her father's coat rolled up in her bag. My father hid things, she said. When he wanted to keep something safe, he put it in the house. The house is probably already being searched. Not the house. The house. She looked at him. My grandfather built that house. My father knew every inch of it. There's a place behind the chimney. Between the stone and the south wall, you can't see it from outside. You can barely find it from inside if you don't know where to look. She paused. My father put things there when I was small, things he needed to keep safe. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a long ride back. I know. The town's going to be watching for you. Probably. He looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing she'd seen to something she'd call respect, though it was a watchful, provisional kind of respect, the kind you give someone who's said the right thing but hasn't proved it yet. You don't have to be part of this, he said. I can take you east. You've got enough of a head start that my father died building a case that nobody listened to, she said, and then they sold me on a platform in the square. I'm already part of this. She looked at him steadily. The question is whether you're willing to let me be useful. He thought about it, really thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't immediately agree or immediately refuse, just sat with it for a moment, which told her that whatever he said next would be what he actually believed. All right, he said. She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter against the mountain cold and looked into the fire and listened to the night move around them. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't safety. It was something thinner than both of those things, harder edged and uncertain, a direction more than a destination, but it was something to move toward. And after a week of watching men decide her future for her, even the smallest sliver of forward motion felt like breathing again. She slept fitfully, waking twice, once when the fire burned down and once when something moved in the trees, which turned out to be a deer. Each time she woke, she looked across the dead fire to where Mercer had his bedroll, and each time he was already awake, sitting up with his back against a tree and his eyes toward the darkness, keeping watch without making anything of it. She didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and eventually she went back to sleep. In the morning, he had coffee ready before she was fully awake. She drank it black and too hot, and it tasted like burned wood, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in a week. He packed up the camp with the same efficient economy he'd built it with, and when she was packed and ready, he was already mounted, watching the trail back toward Black Ridge. "The back approach," she said, pulling up beside him. "There's a deer path along the eastern ridge, comes down behind Dolores Finch's property. If we come in that way, we'd avoid the main road." "Yes." He considered it, nodded once. She'd grown up in those hills, knew every bend and hollow of the terrain around Black Ridge the way you know, a place you've roamed your entire life. She took the lead without asking permission because she didn't need it, and she heard him fall in behind her without comment. The sun was up and the sky was enormous above them, and somewhere ahead of them, through the trees, the answers her father had died to protect were waiting in the dark space behind an old stone chimney. She didn't know yet what they'd find there, but she knew she was done being the woman things happened to. The deer path was narrower than she remembered, overgrown in places where the spring growth had come in thick, and twice her horse had to pick its way carefully over exposed roots that crossed the trail at awkward angles. She kept her eyes moving, on the path ahead, on the tree line to either side, back over her shoulder to where Mercer rode close behind her, close enough that she could hear his horse breathing. She'd grown up running these hills. She knew where the path dipped toward the creek, and where it rose again along the eastern ridge, knew the big split-trunk pine that marked the turn toward Dolores's back fence, knew the hollow where the ground went soft even in dry summers, because something underground kept feeding it moisture. She moved through it the way you move through a place that's in your body, not just your memory, without thinking much, just reading the terrain as it came. What she was thinking about was the chimney. Her father had shown her the space behind it when she was 8 years old, on a winter afternoon when the two of them were splitting wood, and she'd asked him why the south wall of the house sat slightly farther from the chimney than the north wall did. He'd crouched down to her level and explained, in the careful way he always explained things he wanted her to actually understand rather than just accept, that her grandfather had built the chimney first and the house second, and that the measurements hadn't quite lined up, and that rather than tear anything down, he'd simply framed around it and left a gap. "About so wide," he'd said, holding his hands apart. A man could fit his arm in there. Or a box, if it wasn't too big. She'd never thought much about it after that. It was just a feature of the house, the way the window in the upstairs landing was slightly lower than it should have been, or the way the back door stuck in humid weather. Part of the specific oddness of a specific place. She thought about it now. They came down off the ridge behind Dolores's property as the morning was working toward midday, the sun high, and the air warm enough that she'd tied her coat behind the saddle. The back fence was a low thing, 3 rails of weathered wood, and she dismounted without discussion and led her horse through the gap where the middle rail had been broken for as long as she could remember. Mercer followed, quiet. He was good at that, at moving through a situation without asking unnecessary questions, at reading what was needed and doing it. She was still calibrating how much of that to trust. "Dolores will see us," she said softly, nodding toward the farmhouse beyond the fence. A window faced the back field. "Is that a problem?" "No, but she'll want to talk and we can't spend much time." She paused. "She's the only person in this town I'd call honest." "Then we don't go past her house. We go around." They went around, skirting the edge of Dolores's property and picking their way through the scrubby stand of cottonwoods that separated the 2 lots. Her family's house came into view slowly, first the roof line, then the back wall, Then the full shape of it sitting in the mid-morning light looking so ordinary that her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. She stopped behind the cottonwoods and studied it. "Anyone in there?" Mercer said beside her. "Can't tell." The windows reflected sky. The door was closed. Nothing moved. "We'd need to get closer." "Wait here." He handed her his horse's reins. "I'm not—" She stopped. He was already moving, low and quick along the fence line toward the corner of the house, and she stood in the cottonwoods holding two horses and feeling the particular irritation of someone who's been sidelined, not out of malice, but out of what someone else thinks is practicality, which almost made it worse. He was back in 4 minutes. Empty, but somebody's been through it. The front door's been opened hard enough to crack the frame, and there's papers on the floor. They already searched it. Looks like. Didn't find what they were looking for from the state of the place. They went through everything, but they left in a hurry. He looked at her. Or they didn't know what they were looking for. She tied both horses to a cottonwood branch and walked toward the house without waiting for him. The back door opened on the kitchen, and what she saw when she stepped in stopped her for a moment in the doorway. It wasn't destroyed. It was turned over in the specific way of a search done by people who were thorough but not careful. Drawers pulled out and dropped. The contents of the pantry swept onto the floor, her father's ledgers piled in the middle of the table and gone through and left open. The coat hook by the door was empty, and for a confused second she thought they'd taken his coat before she remembered it was rolled up in her bag. She walked through the kitchen to the main room without stopping to look at any of it. Looking too closely would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend right now. The fireplace was in the south wall, river stone mortared together, floor to ceiling, with a wide hearth that her father had laid himself. On the left side of it, about a foot from the corner where the chimney met the exterior wall, there was a gap between the stone and the interior framing. From the front you couldn't see it. The shadow of the chimney fell across it and the angle was wrong, and you'd have to know to look. She'd known since she was 8. She crouched down beside the hearth and worked her arm into the gap. Cold air moved against her skin. The chimney pulled draft through it. She felt rough stone, the edge of a timber, and then, set back further than she remembered, the corner of something solid. "There's something here," she said. Mercer crouched beside her. "Can you reach it?" "Barely." She pressed herself flatter against the wall and pushed her arm into the shoulder. Her fingers found the edge. Wood, flat, a box of some kind. And she got 2 fingertips behind it and pulled. And it scraped against the stone and caught, and she pulled harder and it came loose in a little rush, and she nearly lost her balance. She sat back and looked at what she'd pulled out. It was a document box, the kind lawyers used, flat and wide with a hinged lid, painted black and gone dusty. Her father's name was written on the lid in his handwriting. Not labeled, just his name, Raymond Holloway, as if he'd needed to claim it. Her hands were shaking slightly. She wasn't sure when that had started. Mercer didn't reach for it, just watched her. She opened it. Inside, papers, a lot of them, folded and stacked, with the careful organization that her father had brought to everything. She lifted the first one and unfolded it. A map. A survey map of the county, hand-annotated in pencil, with lines drawn in 2 different colors, one in the original ink and one added over the top in a different hand. Property boundaries labeled with names she recognized. Holloway, Finch, Garrett, Burke, and over them, crossed out or shifted, new lines drawn in pencil with new names. Cade Holdings, Cade Ranching, Black Ridge Land Trust. "He mapped it," she said quietly. "He mapped every parcel they moved." Mercer took the map carefully. His eyes moved over it with the focused attention of someone reading a document they've been trying to find for a long time. "Look at the creek," he said, and pointed. "Every parcel along the North Fork. See how the boundary shifted? Someone redrew the survey lines. Your father's land, Garrett's, the Burke Widow's quarter section, all of it absorbed into Cade Holdings in a 2-year window. With forged documents, and underneath. He lifted the map and held it toward the window light. "See there? The original survey markers traced in pencil." He was documenting where the real lines were. She went through the rest of the box while Mercer held the map. There were copies of deeds, some originals, she thought, or close to it, with annotations in her father's handwriting noting discrepancies between the filed copies at the county seat and the copies held by the affected landowners. There were letters, 3 of them, addressed to the circuit judge's office, with dates spanning the previous autumn. There were affidavits, signed statements from 4 different landowners, 2 of whom she recognized, attesting to the fact that they had not willingly sold their properties, that they had been presented with documents they didn't fully understand and pressured to sign, that the prices they'd received bore no relationship to what had been represented to them. And at the bottom of the box, loose, a single sheet in different handwriting from everything else, a ledger page torn from a bound book with columns of figures and initials. She stared at it. "This isn't my father's handwriting," she said. Mercer looked at it. Something shifted in his face, careful, controlled, but there. "No, that's from an accounting book. See those initials? WC, HC, and that one," he pointed. "TF, that's Tom Farrow. He was the county surveyor until 18 months ago. Disappeared." He looked at her. He didn't disappear. He was paid to leave. That's what this is, a record of payments. To the surveyor, to whoever filed the false deeds, to the deputy who produced the warrant on me. My father got hold of an inside document. Somebody gave it to him, somebody who was scared and wanted a way out. He set the ledger page down. "This is everything. This is a complete record." She sat back on her heels and looked at the box. The paper was old in some cases, careful in all cases, built over months by a man sitting at his own kitchen table while she sat nearby reading without knowing what he was doing. Her throat was tight. She pushed it down. "We need to go," she said. "Yes." She put everything back in the box and closed the lid. She stood up. And then, because she couldn't quite help it, she let herself look around the room one more time, at the curtains her mother had sewn and she had kept, at the chair by the fire where her father had read in the evenings, at the empty peg by the kitchen door. "He was careful," Mercer said. Not quite gently, but close. "He was," she said. "He was the most careful man I ever knew, and they still got to him." She didn't wait for a response. She walked through the kitchen and out the back door into the sun. They were through the cottonwoods and almost to the horses when the sound came. Hooves on hard ground, more than one horse, coming fast from the direction of the main road. She and Mercer both went still at the same instant, and in that stillness she heard voices, 2 men, not bothering to be quiet. Said she might have come back, check the house, and then swing by the Finch property. "Ooh." Mercer had her arm, and they were moving before she'd finished processing the words. Back through the cottonwoods at a crouch. Horses untied in seconds, moving east away from the approaching sound through the screening trees. She didn't mount until they were far enough into the scrub that the foliage would break the sight line, and then she went up fast and they moved at a careful walk, letting the ground muffle the hoofbeats. She looked back once. 2 riders were coming around the far side of the house. She caught a flash of them between the trees. She recognized the one in front by his hat. Deputy Cal Trent, Harlan Cade's man, as bought as a man could be. They kept moving east until the sounds faded behind them. When they were clear, she let out a slow breath. Her heart was still going too fast, that specific unsteady rhythm that doesn't come from exertion, but from your body catching up to how close something was. "You all right?" Mercer said. Yes. It was mostly true. He glanced at the document box, which she'd pushed into her saddlebag. "They'll figure out we were there. The dust, the door. I know. And if Trent reports back to Harlan Cade, then Harlan Cade knows we have the box." She looked at him. "Which means we can't just run. If we run with those papers and nothing else, they'll find us eventually and take them, and then we're back to the same place we started. Worse, because then they'll know what to destroy." Mercer was quiet. She'd started to understand that his silences were a form of thinking, not avoidance, that he went quiet when he was working through something real. "The circuit judge," he said finally. "My father already tried that." "Your father tried it alone with the letter. We'd be coming in person, with the box." He paused. "Judge Alderley is in Creekfall. 3 days' ride if we push. He's not Cade's man. I know that because Cade's been trying to buy him for 2 years and couldn't. And if we don't make it to Creekfall, then we don't make it. He said it straight, without drama. But the alternative is hiding in the mountains with papers that don't help anyone and a warrant that doesn't go away. She looked at the trail ahead. The sky was still enormous, the afternoon still bright, the land still indifferent in the way that land always is. Neither hostile nor welcoming, just there, waiting to be crossed. 3 days, she said. Give or take. They'll come after us. Probably before nightfall. She settled her weight in the saddle and adjusted her grip on the reins. The document box pressed against her leg through the saddlebag, solid and specific as a heartbeat. Then we'd better not waste the afternoon, she said, and pushed her horse forward. He fell in beside her this time, not behind, and they rode east together as the shadows started their long lean toward evening. They made good time through the afternoon, pushing east along the high trail where the ground was hard and the footing reliable, putting distance between themselves and Black Ridge with the steady, unromantic efficiency of people who understood that speed now was worth discomfort later. She didn't talk much, neither did he. The terrain demanded attention, and the silence had settled into something less fraught than it had been the first day. Not easy, exactly, but functional, the way two people can share a space without friction once they've stopped trying to figure each other out and started just watching how the other moves. She was watching how he moved. He was careful in ways she hadn't expected, not just in the obvious sense, the constant reading of the trail and the skyline and the shadows in the tree line, but in smaller ways. He never took the better campsite position without offering it. He split tasks without assigning them, just picked up whatever she hadn't and did it. When she said something he disagreed with, he said so plainly, without the particular edge that men sometimes put on corrections delivered to women, that slight emphasis that means you should have known better. He just said what he thought and waited to see what she said back. She wasn't sure what to do with that yet. She'd decided early to trust the situation rather than the man. The document box was real, the survey map was real, the ledger page with its damning columns of figures was real, and these things would still be real regardless of what Colt Mercer turned out to be. That was the solid ground she was standing on, and she intended to keep standing on it. The first night out from Black Ridge, they camped without a fire. His decision offered as a question. Better without one, this close. You mind? She didn't mind. She minded being cold, which was different, and she spent part of the night in her coat and her father's coat on top of it, watching the dark and thinking about the circuit judge in Creekfall and what 3 days of being hunted actually looked like. The answer came partway through the second day. She heard them before she saw them. Hoofbeats on the lower trail, moving faster than the terrain should have allowed, which told her the riders knew the area or didn't care about their horses, and neither option was good. She and Mercer were crossing an open stretch of hillside when the sound reached them, and he set off the trail, right? Now in a voice that had no urgency in it, but somehow communicated urgency anyway, and they moved into the timber on the right side and went still. 3 riders below them, moving northeast. She recognized one of them, the bounty hunter called Dix, a wide-shouldered man in a brown coat who operated out of the territory's southern counties and who had a reputation for bringing people in alive only when alive was specified. He wasn't riding for Harlan Cade directly. Nobody like Dix ever worked directly for anyone. But the money reached the same hands in the end. They're tracking us, she said, very quiet. Yeah, but they've got the wrong angle. He watched the riders below them through a gap in the trees. They think we went northeast. We've been trending east-southeast. For how long? Until they figure out the mistake. He pulled back from the gap. We keep moving, faster than we've been. They moved faster than they'd been, cutting south around a ridge she didn't know. To find a creek crossing he did, pushing through the afternoon until the horses were blowing hard and her back ached with the particular deep pain of too many hours in the saddle. She didn't complain. Complaining required attention she was using for other things. They stopped at dusk in a ravine with a thin stream running through it, steep walls on 2 sides, the only approach from the south where they'd have a sight line. Mercer took first watch without discussion, and she was asleep almost before she'd finished the thought that she should try to stay awake a little longer. She woke to his hand on her shoulder. Light, no urgency, more announcement than alarm. Your turn, he said. She sat up. He handed her the rifle, which she took without comment. He was asleep in under 2 minutes, which told her something about how tired he actually was. All the economy of movement and the steady watchfulness running on a reserve that was lower than he showed. She watched the southern approach and drank cold water and thought about her father. The thing she kept coming back to was not the grief. The grief was there, but it was a known quantity now, something she carried rather than something that moved through her. But the shape of what he'd been doing, the months of careful documentation, the letters to the circuit judge, the survey map with its 2 sets of lines, original and forged, laid over each other like an argument about what the truth was. He'd known it was dangerous. He'd kept going anyway, kept adding to the box, kept reaching for some authority that could actually do something with what he found. And then he'd gotten sick, and someone had come to him with a pen and a paper while he couldn't properly hold a pen, and after that he hadn't gotten better. She thought about that for a long time in the dark of the ravine, with the creek moving quietly over its stones and Mercer breathing steadily behind her, and the stars very bright above the ravine's steep walls. She thought, he knew he was dying, and he still hid the box. Not morbidity, practicality. He'd known what it meant if the box was found, and he'd put it somewhere no one would find it, and he'd trusted that she would know the house well enough to find it herself when the time came. He hadn't told her directly, which at first had felt like a withholding, but now seemed like the opposite. He'd trusted her to get there on her own. He'd trusted her to survive whatever came after him in a way that she wasn't sure she deserved, but intended to. She kept watch until the first gray of the sky before dawn, when Mercer woke on his own and took back the rifle and told her to sleep another hour. She did. The third day was harder than the first 2 combined. The trail through the high country between the ridges had washed out in spring flooding, and what remained was narrow and treacherous, loose shale on a steep slope that the horses didn't like, and that Tessa didn't like either, picking her way down on foot with the reins in her hand and her boots sliding on the wet rock. Mercer was ahead of her, coaxing his horse through a particularly bad stretch, and she was watching her footing and not the trail behind her, which was why she didn't see the man step out of the trees until he was already there. She went absolutely still. He was young, younger than she expected, maybe 20, with the raw-boned look of someone who'd been large quickly and hadn't finished filling into it. He had a rifle, and he had it pointed at her chest, and he had the particular expression of someone trying very hard to look like he knows what he's doing because he's not entirely sure he does. "That's far enough," he said. She kept her hands visible and didn't reach for anything. "All right, you're the Holloway woman." It wasn't a question. "I am." He glanced up the slope toward where Mercer had stopped and turned around, rifle already in hand, taking in the situation with the rapid stillness of someone running calculations. 3 of them. Her, the young man, Mercer. The angles weren't good for any of them, which was maybe the only thing keeping the situation from immediately getting worse. "Dick sent you?" Mercer said. The young man's eyes went back to him. "I'm collecting the bounty on Colt Mercer. That's all I'm here for." "How old are you?" A flicker of something. Offense, maybe, or the beginning of uncertainty. "Old enough." "Who told you there was a bounty?" "Everyone knows about the bounty." $300, Mercer said. "That what you heard?" $400. "And you rode out here alone?" The young man's jaw tightened. I'm not mocking you," Mercer said, and his voice was level and strangely patient. "I'm telling you that Dix sent you up here alone because if this goes wrong, you're the one who goes wrong. Dix doesn't lose anything. You understand that?" Silence. The shale shifted under someone's boot. Hers, she'd moved slightly, just recalibrating her weight, and the young man's attention snapped back to her and she met his eyes steadily. "The bounty's fraudulent," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The warrant. The charges. We have documentation proving that the man who filed the warrant on Colt Mercer is the same man who forged land deeds and stole property from a dozen families in this county." She kept her voice even, the way she'd learned to keep it when she needed someone to actually hear her rather than just react to her. "We're writing to Creekfall to present those documents to Judge Alderley. If the warrant is vacated, which it will be, then there is no bounty. And anyone who helped enforce it would have a very difficult conversation with the territorial authorities." The rifle had dropped about an inch. Not much, but enough to tell her he was thinking. "You're just saying that," he said. "I have the documents in my saddlebag." She didn't move her hands, just nodded toward it. "You're welcome to look. The survey maps alone will tell you enough." A long pause. The wind came through the shale and knocked a few small stones loose, and they rattled down the slope below them. "My father lost his land," the young man said. He said it almost involuntarily, like something that had been waiting behind his teeth. 2 years ago, said he signed something he didn't fully understand. She looked at him carefully. "What's your father's name?" "Elias Burke." She thought of the document box. The quarter section in the survey map notated as Burke, transferred Cade Holdings. One of the affidavits at the bottom of the stack, signed in a hand that had pressed hard on the pen, the letters large and slightly uneven, the signature of a man who didn't write much. "Your father signed an affidavit," she said. "It's in the box. His statement about what happened, in his own words, with his signature." She paused. "My father collected it. He was building the case." The rifle came down. Not all the way. The young man wasn't naive enough for that, or maybe just not sure enough. But it angled toward the ground, and his face changed into something younger than it had been, something that hadn't quite figured out yet whether to be relieved or angry or ashamed. "What do I do?" he said. "Go back to wherever Dix is camped," Mercer said, "and don't tell him you found us. Tell him the trail went cold north of the ridge. And if the judge does what you say, then bring your father to Creek Fall when the hearing is set," Tessa said. "His affidavit is evidence. He has a right to be there." The young man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mercer. Then he stepped back off the trail and let them pass. They didn't speak about it until they were down off the shale and onto solid ground again, the horses moving easier, the tree line closing around them. "Burke's boy," Mercer said. "He could still change his mind and go back to Dix." "He could." He was quiet for a moment. "He won't." She wasn't as certain as he was, but she didn't argue it. You made the best judgment you could with the information you had, and then you kept moving, because the alternative was standing still and being overtaken. They reached the outer edge of Creek Falls County in the late afternoon of the third day. The town itself visible in the valley below as a collection of rooftops and the thin lines of smoke from chimneys. And she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was held tight. And then Mercer's horse shied hard to the left, and she heard the shot a half-second after, the crack of it rolling back from the rocky hillside to the east, and she was pulling her horse around and shouting his name before she'd processed what she was doing. He was still in the saddle, she could see that immediately, but leaning wrong, the reins loose in one hand and the other pressed to his left side. His horse had settled but was blowing hard, ears flat. "Mercer." She was beside him, reaching for his arm. "How bad?" "I've had worse." He said it through his teeth, which meant it was bad enough. She looked toward the eastern hillside. Nothing moved. One shot, no follow-up, either a poor position or a warning or a shooter who was already relocating. "We need to move," she said. "I know." "Can you ride?" He answered by picking up his reins, which she took as a yes and hoped it was true. They went down the switchback into the valley fast, faster than was smart on the loose ground, Mercer staying in the saddle through what had to be considerable effort. She kept her horse close to his, close enough to grab him if he started to go, and he didn't look at her but once, briefly. And what was in his face in that moment was not gratitude exactly. It was something more stripped down than that. The expression of someone who isn't used to having anyone close enough to catch them. They came into Creek Fall from the western road at dusk, her horse's shoulder nearly touching his, the document box in her saddlebag, one man wounded and the other bleeding, and the circuit judge's office a quarter-mile ahead with a lamp burning in its window. She didn't let herself think about how close the shot had been. She didn't let herself think about the hillside or who was on it, or whether they'd try again tonight, or wait. She kept her eyes on that lamp and kept riding, and Mercer kept riding beside her, and the town came up around them, and the lamp stayed lit. The judge's office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the man behind the desk looked up at them with the particular expression of someone who has seen enough trouble walk through his door that he no longer shows surprise at what form it takes. Judge Alderley was somewhere in his 60s, thick through the chest, with a white beard kept short and eyes that were gray and observant and gave nothing away freely. He took in Tessa first, then Mercer, then the blood showing dark through the left side of Mercer's coat, and he stood up without theatrics and said, "Sit him down and tell me what happened." She told him. Not everything at once. She'd learned by then how to put things in the order that made them make sense to a stranger, to lead with the facts that were provable before the facts that were only probable. She put the document box on his desk and opened it and laid out the survey map first, then the affidavits, then the ledger page. She talked for a long time. Alderley listened without interrupting, which she took as a sign of either patience or intelligence, and maybe both. Mercer sat in the chair against the wall and didn't say much. The doctor Alderley had sent for arrived partway through her account and worked on the wound while she kept talking, because she had the sense that stopping would be worse than the distraction. The bullet had gone through clean, the doctor said, in and out below the ribs, missing anything that would have killed him quickly, but enough to make infection a real threat if they weren't careful. Mercer took the stitching without complaint, which she watched from the corner of her eye and found she couldn't entirely look away from. Not the wound itself, but his face during it, controlled and distant, like someone who had learned to send themselves somewhere else when the body was in pain. When she finished, Alderley was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers spread across his desk. "Raymond Holloway," he said. "He wrote to my office last November." "I know. He told me he'd tried." "The letter was received. I assigned a clerk to look into it." He paused. The clerk reported back that the deed records at the county seat appeared to be in order. I had no reason to disbelieve him at the time. She looked at him. "And now?" Alderley picked up the ledger page and studied it. "The initials here. W.C. and H.C. Wallace and Harlan Cade, presumably. This one, R.D. He looked up. "Roy Decker. He was the clerk I assigned." The silence that followed that had a particular quality, not shock exactly, but the specific, slightly sick feeling of a pattern completing itself. The last piece turning over to reveal that the picture is worse than you thought. "They were already inside your office," she said. "Apparently." He said it flatly, without excusing it or inflating it, "which means that when your father wrote to me, he was already being watched. And when my clerk reported back, the Cades knew the investigation was closed before it started." He set the ledger page down. "Miss Holloway, how many people know you came here?" "One, possibly. A bounty hunter named Dix. We think he had a shooter on the ridge east of town. We also encountered a young man working for Dix, who we believe chose not to report back." "Burke's boy, if I had to guess," Mercer said from the chair against the wall. His voice was thinner than it had been that morning, but steady. Alderley looked at him for a moment. "Colt Mercer, I've read the warrant." "I'd imagine. I'd also like to hear your account of the incident cited therein, when you're capable of giving it." "I'm capable now." "Tomorrow," Alderley said in a tone that ended that. He looked back at Tessa. "You'll both stay here tonight. I have a deputy. One I trust before you ask, because I know how that sounds right now. And he'll keep watch. In the morning, I'll send a rider to the Territorial Marshal's office in Harlan. This is beyond what my office can handle alone. How long will the marshal take?" 3 days if I request urgency. Maybe 2 if I phrase it correctly. He looked at her steadily. "I need you to understand that this won't be fast. What you've brought me is significant. But significant things move through institutional channels at institutional speeds, and the Cades have resources. They'll lawyer and delay if they get wind of it. Then they shouldn't get wind of it." "No," he said, "they shouldn't." She slept that night in a real bed for the first time in 4 days, in a room above the post office that Alderley's deputy arranged for her, and she slept badly. Not from fear, but from the specific restlessness of someone whose body has been in motion so long that stopping feels wrong. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of creekfall settling into night, and she thought about the 2 days it would take the marshal's rider to arrive, and about everything that could happen in 2 days when the people you were trying to outmaneuver had money and influence and a sheriff and 2 deputies who answered to them. In the morning, Mercer was worse. Not dramatically. He was upright, dressed, arguing with the doctor about whether he could ride, which she took as a sign that he was functional enough to be difficult. But his face had the gray, careful quality of someone managing pain by concentrating very hard. And when he reached for his coffee cup, his left hand wasn't entirely cooperative. "You can't ride," she said. "I know." He said it like it cost him something. "You need to stay here until the marshal arrives." "That's what I'm telling him," the doctor said. "The marshal arrives in 2 days," Mercer said. The Cades will know we're here before that. Dix's shooter reports back, they put it together. If Harlan Cade decides to move before the marshal, then I'll be here, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, Shipista, she said, and I'm not entirely without resources. She thought of the document box, now locked in Alderley's safe. She thought of the survey map, which she'd looked at long enough to have its major features memorized. If someone needs to be in two places at once, we figure that out when we need to. He didn't argue further, which she suspected was less agreement than exhaustion. She left him with the doctor and went to find Alderley. The judge was already at his desk. He hadn't, she suspected, left it for very long. I want to make copies, she said, of the key documents, the survey map and the ledger page especially. If the originals are compromised, I thought of that this morning. He slid a stack of blank paper toward her. My handwriting is better than most. Tell me which to start with. They spent the morning copying. It was slow and detailed work, and she appreciated that Alderley brought the same care to it that her father had brought to the originals. No shortcuts, no abbreviations, every notated discrepancy on the survey map reproduced exactly. He asked questions while they worked, good questions, the kind that told her he was building the case in his head as they went, understanding not just what the documents said, but what they proved and what they implied and where the gaps were. The affidavits, he said at one point. 4 of them. How many families does this actually affect? My father's map has 11 parcels, she said, but some of those may have sold willingly at unfair prices, which is a different thing legally. Different, but not irrelevant. He looked at the map. If the water rights along the North Fork were consolidated under Cade Holdings through a combination of fraud and economic pressure, that's a pattern of conduct that goes beyond individual land grabs. That's a scheme. That's a different category of offense. And a different category of penalty. Yes. He held the map at an angle and studied the penciled-in original survey lines. Your father understood that. This is prosecution-ready work, Miss Holloway. This isn't a grievance. This is evidence. She thought about her father at his kitchen table on winter evenings. He was a careful man, she said, the same thing Mercer had said on the trail, and it hit differently here, in a room where careful work was understood. The writer went out to the territorial marshal's office at mid-morning. Alderley didn't advertise it, didn't send the man through the center of town, just had him go quietly out the back with a sealed letter and the instruction to push the horse. The rest of the day was an exercise in waiting. She didn't do it well. She checked on Mercer twice. The second time he was asleep, which was better than the alternative, and she sat for a few minutes in the chair beside his bed and looked at the ceiling and tried not to think too hard about any single thing. She talked to Alderley's deputy, a man named Sam Prout, who was young and serious and carried his authority the way young, serious men do, slightly too carefully, like something that might break if not handled correctly. She liked him. You grew up in Black Ridge, he asked. All my life. Must be strange. Knowing people your whole life and then finding out... He stopped. Sorry, that's not my business. It's not strange, she said. It's more like you knew something was wrong with a door your whole life, the way it stuck or didn't hang right, and you just worked around it and didn't think about it. And then someone takes the door off, and you see that the frame was rotten the whole time. She paused. The strange part is realizing you already knew, somewhere. You just didn't let yourself look. Prout thought about that. Did you? No. She considered it honestly. I knew that Wallace Cade was a man people were careful around. I knew my father got quieter about his land troubles after a certain point, the way men get quiet when they've decided they're handling something alone. I knew the numbers Greer showed me didn't feel right, but I had no way to... She stopped. You do the math you can do with the numbers you have. You don't know the equation is wrong until someone shows you the whole thing. You were so much... He nodded slowly. That's true of a lot of things. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the trouble arrived. Not Dix, not a bounty hunter. It was a man in a good coat who rode into Creekfall with 2 others behind him and tied his horse in front of the hotel and asked the desk clerk, loudly enough that it reached Prout 20 minutes later, whether Judge Alderley had any visitors in the past few days. Prout told her. She went immediately to Alderley. Harlan Cade, Alderley said. He didn't look surprised. Or one of his men. They moved faster than 2 days. Someone in this town talked, or they had someone watching the road and drew their own conclusions. He stood up. I need you to stay in this building. And do what? Stay, he said firmly. Miss Holloway, if Harlan Cade comes to my office, I will handle it. That is what a judge does. If you are visibly in this office, it confirms what he suspects, and it escalates a situation that I would very much like to keep from escalating prematurely. He looked at her steadily. I understand that sitting still is not your preference. Do it anyway. She sat still. For about 40 minutes, she sat in the back room of Alderley's office and listened to the building and the street and her own thoughts. And then she heard the front door open and 2 sets of boots on the floor, and Alderley's voice saying good afternoon. And another voice, smooth and surface pleasant, the voice of a man accustomed to conversations going the way he wanted them to. She'd never met Harlan Cade. She knew the name, and she knew the shape of what he'd done, but she didn't know the voice. And hearing it now, that particular ease of it, the confidence of someone who'd operated for years in a system built to accommodate him, produced in her a cold, specific anger that settled in her chest like ballast. She stayed in the back room. She heard pleasantries, the weather, the state of the roads. She heard Cade mention that he had business interests in the region that sometimes required him to consult with the circuit court. She heard Alderley say that was certainly understandable. The circuit court was available to all parties for legitimate purposes. She heard Cade say that he'd heard a woman had come to town, a woman from Black Ridge, and that there was some concern about her mental state given recent difficulties with her family. She pressed her back teeth together. She heard Alderley say that he wasn't aware of any visitors matching that description, and that if Mr. Cade had specific concerns about a citizen's well-being, the appropriate avenue would be to put them in writing and file them with the relevant county office. She heard Cade laugh, warmly, appreciatively, the laugh of a man who recognizes a good move. She heard him leave. She stayed in the back room until Prout came to get her, which was 15 minutes after the sound of hooves on the street outside. He didn't believe Alderley, she said. It wasn't a question. No, Prout said. But he also didn't push it, which means he's going to try something else. She stood up and walked to the window that looked out on the back alley behind the building. The afternoon was thickening toward evening, the light going golden and long. He knows the marshal's been sent for, she said, or he suspects it. He needs to resolve this before the marshal arrives. She thought about it. He'll move tonight. That's what the judge thinks too. She turned from the window. Then we need to be ready before he does. Prout looked at her with the expression of someone who is 23 and experienced enough to know when they're talking to someone who has already worked out most of the plan, and smart enough not to pretend otherwise. What do you need? He said. I need to talk to Mercer, she said. And I need a second copy of the ledger page hidden somewhere outside this building, somewhere that doesn't burn if this building burns. She saw his expression. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being practical. There's a difference. Yes, ma'am, he said, and she almost smiled at the ma'am, at being accorded something she wasn't sure she'd ever been accorded in Black Ridge. She went to Mercer. He was awake now, propped up, looking like a man who'd been lying still for too long and was running out of patience with it. They're here, she said. I heard. He'd heard the voice from down the hall. The walls weren't thick. How long before he moves? Tonight, we think. He won't wait for morning. She sat on the edge of the chair. I need to know, is there anyone in Creekfall who'd side with him? Anyone with an arrangement, like Dick's? The liveryman used to have business with Wallace Cade. Don't know if that extends to Harlan. He thought about it. Anyone running freight north through the pass would have had to deal with one or the other of them at some point. So we can't know who's been reached. Not for certain. No. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, What would you do if you were him? He looked at her. It was a genuine question, and he treated it as one, taking a moment to think about it rather than answering fast. He can't take the judge. That's a line even a man like Harlan Cade knows not to cross with federal authority. He shifted slightly, adjusted for the pain, kept going. He can take us. Make it look like a frontier incident. Wanted man. Dangerous woman who was bought in a legitimate settlement arrangement and then absconded. File his own version of the story before ours can be heard. He paused. He'd want the box too, or want it destroyed. The box is in Alderley's safe. A safe can be opened. She nodded. I've already asked Prout to move a copy outside the building. He looked at her for a moment with the same expression he'd worn briefly on the trail, that provisional, watchful thing that was close to respect but hadn't fully decided to be. "All right," he said. "I need you to stay in this room tonight," she said. "I know you'd rather—" "I know my limitations right now," he said. Not happy about it. Not pretending to be happy about it. Just honest. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make it so that taking us doesn't solve his problem," she said. "I'm going to make it so that the story is already told before he gets the chance to tell his version." He waited. "There are people in Creekfall," she said. "Merchants, landowners, people who have been living next to the Cade's operation for years and watching things not add up. If I can talk to enough of them tonight, show them the survey map, show them the ledger page, then Harlan Cade can't make this about a wanted man and a difficult woman. He can't make it go away quietly when it's already not quiet." Mercer was silent for a moment. "That's either very smart or very dangerous." "Probably both," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen. "Yeah," he said, "probably both." She stood up. Outside the window, the last of the day's light was pulling west, and somewhere in Creekfall, a man in a good coat was working out how to make two people disappear before morning. She pulled on her coat, her own coat, not her father's, which she'd folded carefully into her bag, and looked at Mercer once more. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll be back before midnight." She went out into the evening and started knocking on doors. She knocked on 11 doors that night, not randomly. She'd asked Prout which merchants had land north of the creek, which families had watched their neighbors sell and wondered about the price, which names appeared in the county records as adjacent to parcels now held by Cade Holdings. He'd given her a list without being asked for one, which confirmed her read of him as someone who thought ahead of the conversation. She went in order, working the streets of Creekfall in the thickening dark with the copied ledger page in her coat pocket and the survey map folded against her ribs. Some doors didn't open. Two opened and closed fast, the faces behind them careful and blank in the way of people who recognized what she was carrying before she'd said a word and wanted no part of it. She didn't hold it against them. Fear was a reasonable response to the Cade name in this county, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But 8 doors opened and stayed open. A grain merchant named Fowler, who'd watched his brother-in-law lose 40 acres on the creek's north bend 2 years prior and never understood how the paperwork had moved so fast. A widow named Clara Stitch, who ran the town's only seamstress shop and who had, it turned out, been approached 3 times by a man representing Cade Holdings about the half-acre her late husband had filed on, approached with offers that dropped each time she refused, which was not how legitimate offers worked. A rancher named Gus Pelham, retired, who had surveyed land in this county for 15 years before the territorial office switched surveyors, and who looked at Raymond Holloway's annotated map for 2 full minutes without speaking, and then said, quietly and with considerable feeling, that the original survey lines had been moved by at least 30 feet in 4 separate locations, and he'd stake his reputation on it. By the time she reached the 11th door, it was past 10 o'clock, and her feet hurt, and her voice had gone slightly rough from talking. She stood on the porch of a house at the east end of Creekfall's main street and explained for the 8th time what was in the document box and what it proved and what she needed. The man in the doorway was older, heavy-set, with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned caution over a long time and a lot of disappointments. His name was August Riley, and he was, Prout had told her, the most respected man in Creekfall's merchant community. Not the wealthiest, but the one people looked to, the one whose opinion carried weight in a room. He listened to all of it. He looked at the ledger page. He looked at the map. Then he said, "Your father, Raymond Holloway. He came through here once, maybe 2 years ago, bought some rope and some nails. We talked about the creek land. I've got a cousin up that way." He paused. He seemed like a man who was carrying something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. "He decided," she said. "He just didn't get enough time." Riley looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "Tomorrow morning, when the marshal's rider arrives, I need people in that square who aren't going to be told to go home by a man in a good coat. I need it to be a public thing, not a backroom proceeding that Harlan Cade can delay or redirect or buy his way around." She met his eyes. "I need witnesses who have their own reasons to care." "And you think that'll hold him?" "I think daylight holds men like him more than laws do," she said. "Laws he can work around. He's been doing it for years. But a square full of people who've already seen the documents and already know what they mean, that's a different problem. Riley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be there, and I'll make some calls tonight." She walked back to Alderley's office through the dark streets of Creekfall, with her hands in her pockets, and her mind running through everything that could still go wrong, which was a long list. Harlan Cade was in this town somewhere. Dix's shooter might still be on the ridge, or might have relocated closer. The marshal's rider might be delayed, might have encountered trouble on the road, might arrive to find a situation already resolved in the wrong direction. She had 8 people who'd open their doors in the morning and about 40 things that could prevent that from mattering. It was what she had. She walked with it. Prout was on the step when she got back. His face told her something had happened before he said a word. "Mercer's gone," he said. She stopped. "What do you mean gone?" "He left. About an hour ago. Doctor found the room empty." He held up a hand before she could speak. He left a note, just 2 lines. He handed it to her. The handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven in a way that suggested it had been written by someone working around pain. "Dix's man is at the East Livery. If he reports to Cade tonight, none of it matters. Don't come after me." She read it twice. Then she looked at Prout and said, "How many horses does the East Livery have saddled right now?" "You're not going—" "How many horses, Prout?" He closed his mouth, opened it again. 2, I think. The judge keeps one ready." "Good," she said, and went inside to get her coat. She found him in the alley behind the East Livery, and the fact that she found him at all was because she knew how to move quietly through a dark town, and because Dix's man, a thin, quick individual she didn't recognize, was making enough noise in his conversation with Mercer to cover her approach entirely. It wasn't a fight, exactly. It was 2 people in an alley, one of them with a gun, and the other with a wound that made the normal advantages unreliable, and both of them very aware of the arithmetic. She came around the corner of the livery wall in time to see Mercer against the building with his hand slightly out, and Dix's man 3 feet from him, speaking low and fast. She hit the man in the back of the knee with a fence post she'd picked up from the alley, which was not elegant but was effective. His leg buckled and he went down sideways, and Mercer caught the gun on the way, and then it was over in the way that sudden things are over, abruptly and incompletely, everyone breathing. "I told you not to come," Mercer said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. His face in the darkness was gray and tight. "That's it? Just I know? You told me not to. I came anyway. We can discuss the principle of it later." She looked at the man on the ground, who was conscious and not happy about it. "Can you walk him to Prout?" "I can walk him to Prout," Mercer said without enthusiasm. They walked him to Prout. It took longer than it should have because Mercer was moving carefully, and she matched her pace to his without commenting on it. And twice she put her hand briefly on his arm when the ground was uneven and he didn't shake it off, which she counted as something. Prout took custody of Dix's man with the expression of someone who has accepted that this night is going to be stranger than anticipated and is choosing professionalism over objection. Alderley appeared from his office at the sound of them, looked at all of it, and said nothing for a long moment. "Are either of you capable of staying put for the next 6 hours?" he said finally. "Yes," Tessa said. "Possibly," Mercer said. Alderley looked at the ceiling briefly. "Get inside, both of you." They got inside. The marshal's rider arrived at 7 in the morning. Not alone. He'd made good time, and the message had apparently conveyed sufficient urgency that the territorial marshal himself had ridden partway before sending the courier ahead. Marshal Everett Hale arrived at 10, a lean man in his 50s with a federal badge and the unhurried manner of someone who dealt in facts and had no patience for anything else. He met with Alderley for 40 minutes. Then he asked to see the documents. Then he sat with them for another 30 minutes, asking questions that were specific and technical, the kind of questions that told her he'd understood what he was looking at before he'd finished asking them. When he came out, he asked her to describe the signature on the debt paper, the one with her father's name. She described it as well as she could, the way it looked right from a distance and wrong up close, the slight difference in the letter shapes from her father's normal hand, the heaviness of the pen pressure. "A man in a fever," Hale said, "or a man who wasn't there." And "My father's hand shook when he was ill," she said. "It didn't shake like that. It just shook. Smaller, finer. The signature on Cade's debt paper is too heavy. Someone pressed down hard trying to get the shape right. Hale wrote something in his notebook. All right, he said. We move now, before he has a chance to hear we're moving. They moved now. She was not part of the arrest. Hale made that clear with the particular politeness of someone who has authority and is choosing to use it carefully. She had done what was needed. Her presence at the arrest itself would complicate the legal proceedings rather than help them. She should stay with Alderley. She accepted this because she could see the logic of it, and because Mercer gave her a look that communicated, plainly and without words, that picking this particular fight would cost more than it was worth. She stood with Alderley on the steps of his office and watched Hale and his deputy walk across the square toward the hotel where Harlan Cade had taken rooms. And she thought about all the things she didn't get to see, didn't get to be in the room for, didn't get to watch play across the face of the man who had engineered her father's death and her own humiliation on a platform in the center of Black Ridge. August Riley was in the square with 6 others when the arrest happened. He'd made his calls. They stood at a respectful distance and watched, and their watching was itself a thing, a record, a witnessing, a statement that this was happening in daylight in front of people who knew what it meant. Harlan Cade came out of the hotel in his good coat, with his hands in front of him and his face arranged into the composed, faintly contemptuous expression of a man who intends to be outraged later in a very expensive legal manner. He didn't look at the people in the square. He looked straight ahead and walked to Hale's wagon with the careful dignity of someone who has decided that dignity is the last thing left. He looked, she thought, like a man who had always believed the system was his to use and was learning for the first time that the current could run the other way. Wallace Cade was arrested in Black Ridge 3 days later, along with Sheriff Braddock and Deputy Cal Trent. Silas Greer turned himself in before the marshal's deputies arrived, which his lawyer presumably advised him would look better, and it did look marginally better, in the way that being slightly less guilty looks marginally better than being fully guilty while also being caught. Roy Decker, the clerk from Alderley's office, disappeared before he could be arrested, which caused a delay that lasted 2 weeks before he was found in a river town 2 counties south, drinking heavily and not particularly surprised to see the marshal's men. She wasn't there for most of it. She heard about it in letters. Alderley wrote to her once a week for 2 months. Dry, detailed letters that read like legal summaries but contained, if you read them right, a kind of satisfaction underneath the procedure. Prout wrote once a short note that said only that Black Ridge was quieter than it had been, and that Dolores Finch had informed several people that she'd known it would come to this, which Tessa found more comforting than most of what came in those weeks. Mercer's warrant was vacated 6 weeks after the arrest, on a Tuesday. She learned this from Alderley's letter, which noted it in the 4th paragraph as if it were an administrative item, which technically it was. The bounty was rescinded. The charges were formally withdrawn. Colt Mercer, wanted man, ceased to exist in the legal sense, leaving behind just a person with a name who was no longer running from it. She was back on her land by then. The process of returning it had not been fast or simple. There were hearings and filings, and 2 separate arguments about chain of title that she sat through in a Creek Fall courtroom with her hands folded in her lap and her face neutral while lawyers said things she mostly understood and occasionally didn't. The debt, the fraudulent debt that had triggered the auction, was voided. The land Cade Holdings had absorbed was frozen and then dispersed through a territorial order that took 4 months to fully execute. The parcels returned to their original owners or, in the case of those who had died or left the county, held in trust pending claim. She got the house back in early autumn. It looked smaller than she remembered, which she understood was just the effect of having lived outside its walls for a season, the way places contract when you return to them after being somewhere else. The fence needed work. The garden was overgrown. The back door still stuck in humid weather. She stood in the kitchen for a long time that first day back, not doing anything in particular, just being in the room, listening to the house settle. Her father's coat was still in her bag. She took it out and hung it on the peg by the door where it belonged. Mercer came in October. She'd half expected this and half not, which was an honest accounting of how little she'd let herself think about it during the months of hearings and letters and the grinding, practical work of reclaiming what had been taken. He rode up the track to the house on a morning with the first real cold in the air and tied his horse at the fence post and walked to the door, and she met him there before he could knock. He looked better than he had in Creek Fall. The wound had healed. She could tell by the way he moved, the ease of it. the absence of that careful compensating stillness he'd carried for weeks. He had his hat on this time, which she'd never seen, and it suited him in the way that things suit people when they're no longer hiding. "You didn't write," she said. "No. I didn't either." "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Are you passing through or staying?" He considered this with the same weight he brought to everything, the genuine consideration that she'd come to understand was not slowness, but honesty. He didn't answer questions he hadn't actually thought about. "I haven't had a place to stay in a long time," he said. "I'd have to figure out what staying looks like." "There's work," she said. "The fence needs doing. The north pasture needs clearing before winter." She paused. "It's not a gracious offer." "I don't need gracious." He looked at her steadily. "I need honest." "Then yes," she said. "Stay." He stayed. It wasn't easy, which she could have predicted and did. Two people with damage and habits and a history of managing alone don't simply fit together like puzzle pieces. They rub against each other in the small ways that matter most, disagree about things that seem minor and turn out to be significant, have to decide over and over whether the friction is worth the company. She was particular about the ledgers, which drove him past patience sometimes. He had silences that could run 3 days, which drove her past patience more than sometimes. He cooked badly. She couldn't mend a harness worth anything. He learned her read of the land and the water faster than she expected. She learned to read his silences, which ones were thinking and which ones were something that had gone wrong inside him and needed time rather than fixing. They didn't talk much about what had happened, not because it was forbidden or avoided, but because it existed between them in a way that talking didn't improve or clarify. It was simply part of the material they were both made of now, the months on the trail and the document box, and the shot on the hillside and the alley behind the livery. She knew the shape of what he'd been through before she met him. He knew the shape of what she'd lost. They didn't need to narrate it. In November, the families who'd gotten their land back organized a meeting in Black Ridge's square. Not a celebration exactly. It was too cold and too complicated for celebration. More like a reckoning. People standing in the square that had held an auction platform 6 months earlier, talking about what came next and how to ensure it couldn't happen again, and who should hold what offices now that the old offices were vacant, and what a fair county government actually looked like when you tried to build one from a position of having seen what an unfair one could do. She spoke at that meeting. She hadn't planned to. She'd gone as a witness, intending to listen. And then August Riley had looked at her across the square and said simply, "Miss Holloway, you know this material better than any of us." And the people around him had turned toward her, and she'd understood that saying "I'd rather not" would be the first small retreat in a direction she didn't want to go. So she spoke. She talked about what her father had found and how he'd found it and what it had cost him. She talked about what the documents showed and what they meant in plain terms, without legal language, in the way that her father had explained things to her when he wanted her to actually understand rather than just accept. She talked about the survey lines and what moving them had done to the families affected, and about the difference between a system that protects people and a system that merely looks like it does. She didn't talk about the auction. She'd made a decision about that, not to erase it, because erasure would be a lie, and she'd made her peace with not lying, but not to center it either, because the auction was one piece of a larger story, and she refused to be reduced to it. She was the woman who'd stood on that platform, yes. She was also the woman who'd climbed back down and gone after the truth that had put her there. The town that had watched her sold listened to her speak and was mostly quiet. Dolores Finch, standing to her left, caught her eye afterward and gave her a look that contained no sentimentality at all, just acknowledgement, a sharp nod, brief, one competent person to another. That, Tessa thought, was the most honest thing anyone gave her that day. Mercer stood at the edge of the square with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he stood in public spaces, slightly separate, not quite at ease. When she came to him after, he said nothing, just fell into step beside her as they walked toward the horses. After a moment, he said, "Your father would have been there for that." "I know," she said. "He was," Mercer said, and he said it quietly, without elaboration, and she understood that he meant it as the plainest kind of statement. That a person's work surviving them is a form of presence. that what Raymond Holloway had built in that document box had been in the square with them, had been in Alderley's office, had been in every courtroom and every hearing, had been in the letter that finally vacated the warrant and the order that returned the land. The careful man's careful work, outlasting the careful man. She thought about that on the ride home, through the November cold with the bare trees standing gray against the sky, and the land rolling away in every direction, familiar and specific in the way that land becomes when you've known it your whole life. She thought about what it means to do something right when you know you may not be around to see it matter. The uncertainty of that. The faith it requires, but not in anything beyond yourself, but in the work itself, in the idea that truth written down and hidden well enough might survive the people trying to bury it. Her father had believed that. He'd hidden the box and trusted that the world contained someone who would find it. He hadn't known it would be her. He hadn't arranged for it to be her. He'd simply done the work as carefully as he could and run out of time, and the work had been enough. She thought that was worth something. Not everything, not a comfort sufficient to the loss, but something real. The world is full of people who do the right thing and are not around to see it land. She thought they deserved to know, if there were any way to know, that sometimes it lands. Back at the house, Mercer got down and unsaddled both horses without being asked, which he did sometimes now. Read what needed doing and did it without turning it into a question. She went inside and started the fire and put coffee on and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, at the fence that was fixed now, at the north pasture cleared and ready for spring. He came in and hung his coat on the hook beside her father's coat and sat at the table. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him. The fire was starting to catch, and the kitchen was warm. "What happens in spring?" he said. "I'm going to fence the north pasture properly and run cattle on it," she said. "The water from the creek, now that the rights are back where they belong, makes it viable." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "You can stay or go. That's still true." He looked at her. After a moment he said, "If I stay." "Then you stay," she said. "On whatever terms make sense. This is still my land and my call. But I don't need someone who owes me. I need someone who's here because they decided to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I decided in October." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you it can be redecided any time. That's not a threat. It's just, that's how it should work. People ought to be somewhere because they choose to keep being there, not because they started." He looked at her with an expression she'd come to know. The one that meant he was thinking something he hadn't said, working out whether to say it. Then he said, "My whole life I've had people tell me what I was. Wanted man, outlaw, problem to be solved." He looked at his cup. "You never did that. You weren't those things." "I was some of them," he said. "Not all, but some. I'm not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not going to tell you I'm simple to live with." "I know that," she said. "And I don't know how to do this very well." "Neither do I," she said. "We can be bad at it together." He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd come to prefer to most people's full ones. "Yeah," he said. "All right." Outside, the November wind moved through the north pasture and the sky was gray and enormous and indifferent in the way that skies are, neither hostile nor welcoming, just present. The coffee was too hot, and she drank it anyway, and across the table from her was a man the world had tried to make into a story about danger and got wrong, and outside was land that people had tried to take and failed, and in the fire was warmth that she'd built with her own hands in her own house. None of it was simple. None of it was finished. Spring would bring work, and probably more arguments, and the ongoing complicated business of building something real with imperfect materials. Herself included, herself especially. But the land was hers. The truth was out. The work her father had done in this kitchen, at this table, had reached the hands it needed to reach. She was still here. That was enough to go on with.